Hi again guys, and welcome to another Rivals match on Gran Turismo, but in particular we are returning again to the world of Gran Turismo 6. Now it's been some time since we did a Gran Turismo 6 related Rivals match, but this time we're featuring a 1v1 match, which is relatively rare. We usually do more cars than that, and it's a requested one between McLaren F1s, specifically the McLaren F1 GTR from the McLaren dealership and the McLaren F1 GTR from the BMW dealership. Now these cars aren't necessarily as similar as you might assume. Yes, they are both McLaren F1s, but they vary wildly. Both cars have very distinct and very significant advantages. So which one is better? Well, as we always do, we'll break down each car on its own around the track, get a feel for how it performs and the overall manners of the vehicle. Then, as always, we'll break down the actual on-paper numbers of both cars, in their tuned form in particular, to see what kind of ultimate potential either of them has, and how that compares to each other. Now, first of all, we have the McLaren F1 GTR from the actual McLaren dealership. This is a full premium model. It is straight up the cheaper car of the two by 50,000 credits, and it is the short tail McLaren F1, if you will. It doesn't have the front and rear and side extensions that the other GTR has. It has the more LM style body kit, just like the LM Road version, and it's a very popular car. It's not difficult to see why. It's got that big BMW engine, a lot of power, over 900 horsepower. It's pretty light, it weighs not much more than 1,000 kilos, and the horsepower per ton is well over 800. It's not difficult to see why it's a popular car. It also has that iconic central mounted driving position, which is perfect for using cockpit cam, and it's just a nice car to drive. The driver feedback is fantastic, it's surprisingly forgiving considering its power, and it's not at all difficult to see why it was such a successful machine. The question is though, how does it compare to the Longtail, a car which definitely has some distinct advantages of its own? Well, the finer liveried Longtail version, seen here in non-premium form, because that's the only form that it has on the game, is available of course from the BMW dealership rather than the McLaren dealership, and that's the way it's always been ever since this car was first introduced on Gran Turismo 4. This is, of the two, the car that's been featured in the Gran Turismo franchise for longer, and it's not difficult to see why it's so popular. It's extremely lightweight at only 950 kilos, and the power is also over 900 horses when fully tuned. Now, significantly with this Longtail version, although it shares a very similar engine and a very similar state of tune in most ways, the torque figure in particular is radically different in peak form. It has around 60 or so pound-feet more, and that's nothing to be sniffed at. The power is similar, the engine capacity is similar, but the torque is much higher. It's also, as we said, a lighter vehicle, and not too surprisingly, the horsepower per ton is quite a bit higher, over 950 in fact. So the fact that it is a little bit more expensive and doesn't have that detailed interior isn't necessarily too much of a payoff, and as you could see from, at least with me driving on this particular circuit, it was the quicker of the two. I didn't expect it to be that much quicker, maybe that's just my driving style, but a pretty big difference between the two cars. And the final note that I'll say about these two vehicles on their own is it's interesting to note that despite the differences between their power and torque in particular, but also stuff like the weight and of course the aerodynamic signature of the cars, which is notably different between the long and short tail, the straight line performance actually isn't that much different. There is a slight difference in acceleration between the two, but the top end speed is fairly similar. They both do around 250 to the high 250s in top end form with low downforce and longer gearing. So that's interesting to take note of for circuits such as the Le Mans. The question of course is though, how do they actually compare in our classic top trump style matchup? Well, let's find out. First of all then, as always, we have the price, and as I already mentioned earlier, the premium version is cheaper, 50 grand cheaper, and of course it gets the point there. Both of these cars are reasonably expensive. They cost a similar kind of price to many of the full-on bespoke prototypes and LMP style vehicles that we have on the game, which indicates a certain level of ability. Now the cars can definitely reach that, but it's still a fairly high price given the kind of vehicles which you'd assume these cars will go up against. As far as the engine capacity goes, as far as I could tell, they both seem to use essentially that same 6.1 litre BMW power plant, just in a slightly different state of tune. And so, of course, I'll be giving both cars an equal point there. As far as the power though, I did mention that both cars have over 900 horsepower, but there is a difference. The F1 GTR, the short tail, does have more power, 5 horsepower more, which isn't a massive difference of course, and as I already said, there's not much between them in a straight line, but nonetheless it does have slightly more. As far as torque though, it does vary, as I mentioned just now, a little bit more. 737 foot-pounds on the BMW version, 675 on the McLaren. Now as I mentioned also, the long-tail BMW livery car is a lot lighter, a full 100 kilos lighter, which given how similar the cars could be, makes a big difference, and it's certainly an advantage, a big advantage in fact, around corners, and you can definitely feel that. The long tail combination of having those improved aerodynamics for stability, but also the much lower weight, definitely comes through on that final liveried version. It feels much more like a full-on prototype, whereas the McLaren version feels more like a traditional GT style machine. And finally, of course, given the fact that they both have similar power, but the BMW version is a lot lighter, not surprisingly at all, the horsepower per ton is significantly higher. 953 is quite a large margin more than the McLaren. So overall, although we're not factoring in lap times in terms of points, it is interesting to note that the long tail is the quicker of the two. But in a relatively rare turn of events, it actually also has more points. So the car which was quicker, for a change, actually wins on paper as well, with 5 points to the 3 points of the premium car. But as I always say, of course, both cars are certainly very, very capable machines, and although they are both, of course, based on the same vehicle underneath, they feel considerably different to each other. And if you can afford to buy both, I would recommend doing so. If you're a McLaren fan, there are definitely things which either car brings to the table which the other one doesn't necessarily offer. If you're looking purely for the best speed, well then I'd probably recommend the long tail. It's simply the faster car. If you like something with a little bit more of a quality feel to it in terms of graphics, with the interior detail, and also the way it feels to drive, I would recommend the McLaren version. It feels more fun, it feels more involved, and it feels like more care has been put into mapping the car into the game, whereas the long tail feels very fast, of course, but not necessarily as passionate. But that's it overall for this particular pick. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.